Hello again, class. This will be the third lesson on the Constitution, and the first one we talked about the Constitutional Convention, some of the big compromises they had to deal with. On our second one, we dealt with the structure of the Constitution, and then in this lesson, we're going to discuss the ratification process because, yes, we look back and we know George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, all those guys are really famous, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, no matter how famous they were, how important they were back then, 39 people in a room can't simply create an entirely new government without, a good portion of the government's consent. So what happened was the Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787. And then most states spend the next year, or the next 3 years in Rhode Island's case, debating whether to ratify the Constitution. All right, ratify is just like an official acceptance or officially agreeing to it. Okay, so now remember this is back right at the start of the country. We had 13 states. So you had to have 13 states were going to debate and decided whether they wanted to change from their old style of government under the Articles of Confederation and adopt this new Constitution. Now the Constitution's rules in Article 7 said that as long as 9 of the states said yes, then the Constitution would become valid, go into effect. So technically you only need 9 states. They were really hoping to make it unanimous. Now, it seems kind of hard for us to fathom now because, after all, we've been using this Constitution for 234 years almost, 233 years. So we just assume, okay, this is what it was. But the fact of the matter is there were sizable portions of the country, or people in the country, sizable portions of people throughout the country, who didn't like the Constitution that was drafted. They thought it gave too much power to an executive like a president. They thought it took too much power away from the states or various other reasons. So there were a lot of people who did not want the country to change over to this Constitution that we've now used for since then. All right, so let's start with the names of these groups. The Federalists, those are supporters of the Constitution. All right, they got this name because the Constitution created a system of federalism. All right, so they're known as Federalists. Next, you had the, quite frankly, not very unique name of Anti-Federalists. They were just against what the Federalists wanted. Hence the name, Anti-Federalists. And these were opponents of the Constitution. Right, so remember, keep those names straight. And it's pretty easy to remember because, the Federalists were for the Constitution. Anti means against. So the Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution. So why? First of all, let's touch very, very briefly on some important Federalists. These included James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. We'll come back to those three gentlemen here in a minute. And in general, the Federalists supported the Constitution because it strengthened the national, meaning the federal government. And they supported a relatively strong executive, i.e. the president. Okay. Now, if, Alexander Hamilton, back during the convention, he actually suggested that the president should serve for life. But that was way, way too much like a king for the rest of the delegates. But nonetheless, he's one of the leading Federalists, and he supports a strong executive. Now, others like James Madison probably weren't that strong, and we'll see throughout the rest of his political career, James Madison's kind of supporting, more power to be held in the states. But certainly compared to the Anti-Federalists, these Federalists supported a relatively strong executive, had a president that could do something. That's what they wanted. because the Articles of Confederation didn't have a president at all, and they saw the weaknesses in not having one. So they wanted one that, that had enough power to get things done. And finally, they believed in a large Republican government. So remember that word Republican we talked about in one of our earlier lessons. That's where people rule, but they do through representatives. They do so through representatives. So the Federalists believed a large Republican government on a national scale could best protect people's rights, which meant that at least initially, now they're going to come around on this, but at least initially, they didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary because the Constitution only gave the government limited powers, and none of those powers violated the people's rights. That was their argument initially. Now, eventually, they're going to agree to a Bill of Rights. And, as an aside, I read a book recently where the author suggested that one of the reasons the Founding Fathers didn't include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution was, they'd spent 4 months in these, hot, humid Philadelphia summer, locked in a room with all the windows and doors closed, and it had taken them so much work and so much compromise and arguments and debates just to get the Constitution written that they simply just didn't have the time or energy or willpower to add a Bill of Rights to it. But nonetheless, afterwards, they went around claiming, well, we didn't really need one because, the people's rights are protected because the government has such limited powers. So the Anti-Federalists, and some of the more famous Anti-Federalists were people like Patrick Henry and George Mason. Now both of those are from Virginia, but there were Anti-Federalists throughout the country. In general, what did the Anti-Federalists want, or how did they view the Constitution? Well, they thought the Constitution took too much power away from the states and gave it to the federal government. Remember, this was all, the big balancing act here was how do you create a government that is, powerful enough to get something done, but not so powerful that it will take away, the state's core functions and the rights of the people. Okay, and they thought, the Anti-Federalists thought, too much power was being taken from the states and given to the federal government. They wanted the legislative branch to be much stronger than the executive branch. Now, because they thought a strong president would start acting like a king. And they were very fearful of a monarchy. You can't understand unless you start really reading a lot of what the Founding Fathers wrote and said back during this time period. You can't understand how fearful they were that a king would sort of pop up in America and take over this democracy that they were starting. And look, for good reason. Most of the world, if not all of the world, in the late 18th century was ruled by kings and monarchs. And, they were starting a new type of government, and they were deathly afraid of, a monarch trying to rise to power in America. Right, so people were constantly fearful and accusing each other of trying to be a monarch, etc. That was often a charge. All right, sort of the way now politicians, they either get accused of being either a socialist or a fascist, or that's sort of the bad word you call an opposing politician these days. Well, back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a monarchist was the name you'd call them. You'd accuse them of trying to set up a monarchy. That would be the bad word you'd call them if you're trying to insult your political opponent. And finally, the Anti-Federalists demanded a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution. Right, they weren't comfortable with this idea that, well, the Constitution doesn't say the government can violate your rights, so I guess therefore it must mean it can't. They wanted something a little more explicit. All right, so now the most famous debate that came out of this disagreement between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were the Federalist Papers. Now, both groups, well, let me back up. In some states, the Constitution, and we'll look at the numbers here in a little bit, but in some states, the vote on the Constitution was very lopsided. almost all of the delegates to the state convention, in some cases all of the delegates, it was unanimous, all of the delegates in some state constitution or some state conventions voted to ratify the Constitution. But in other states, like New York, the vote was going to be very, very close. And so both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists began writing a series of essays and publishing them in New York papers. And what happened is they would publish them. They were really aiming for a New York audience, but then newspapers throughout the country started picking them up. And so both sides started laying out their arguments, either for or against the Constitution. And the essays written by the Federalists became known as the Federalist Papers. And ultimately, there were 85 essays. They were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And I think John Jay, I know. He only wrote about 5 of them. And I think it's because he got sick and maybe got busy in other matters. But John Jay wrote 5 of these 85. So the other 80 were written by Hamilton and Madison. And even of that group, Hamilton wrote quite a bit more. I believe Hamilton wrote 51 to Madison's 29. All right, so Hamilton by himself wrote more than half the essays. But the 3 of them combined to write 85 essays. And I can't remember off the top of my head. I believe it was over a period of maybe 6 months. They wrote these 85 essays over a period of 6 months or so, somewhere around there. And what these series of essays do is they explain why ratifying the Constitution was a good idea. And a lot of it is they're simply rejecting the Anti-Federalist arguments. A lot of these Federalist essays, will start as like, people say this horrible thing about the Constitution, but here's why what they're saying is completely wrong and unfounded. So that's what it was. A series of essays trying to persuade people that the Anti-Federalists were overreacting, and in fact that the Constitution was a really good idea. So, as I was saying, most states ended up holding votes over the next year. And again, it wouldn't be a statewide vote. They didn't allow every voter in the state to vote on the Constitution. They basically called for conventions, big meetings, and the state legislatures would appoint delegates to go to this meeting. And then they'd talk about the arguments for and against and have votes. And the Constitution states that it becomes effective once 9 states vote in favor of it, which technically happened when New Hampshire ratified the Constitution in June of 1788. Everybody had been focusing on Virginia because they thought Virginia was going to be up, and it wasn't at all clear. And if you look at this vote, Virginia voted in favor 89 to 79. If you look at Virginia, the 10th name on that list on the right, they won it by 10 votes. It wasn't a runaway in Virginia. And so a lot of people were worried that Virginia was going to vote no. And being the biggest state at the time, it was extremely important that Virginia voted yes. It would be hard to move forward with this Constitution if some of these big states like Virginia and New York, the 2 biggest states at the time, voted no. And so that's why you see those happened, kind of late in the game. You had some states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they were almost ready to vote right away. The Constitution was signed in Philadelphia in September of 1787, and by December, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey had already, gotten the Constitution, planned a convention, named delegates, had the delegates go to the convention, debate, vote, and it was done. And then you see Georgia, Connecticut, 1 month later, they were ready. And if you look at some of those early votes, you see why they were able to move so quickly. Delaware was unanimous. Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia all voted unanimously in favor of the Constitution. Pennsylvania, it wasn't unanimous, but it was still by a 2-to-1 margin. Then you go down to Connecticut. Again, 128 votes for, 40 against. That was pretty lopsided. It was more than 3-to-1. And it's not until you start to get to Massachusetts, and then later New Hampshire, Virginia, and some of the later votes were all a little bit more close. So I'm sure that's why those conventions weren't called until later, because people in that state were still debating back and forth, and it wasn't clear which side they were going to land on. So the end result is that, and the reason some of these votes were delayed, and the reason in places like Virginia and New York, where you did have a lot of people objecting to the Constitution, the reason those votes eventually come out yes is because the Federalists eventually agreed to add a Bill of Rights. All right, the Anti-Federalists said, we don't want a Bill of Rights, we don't want a Bill of Rights. I'm sorry, the Anti-Federalists said, we don't want this Constitution without a Bill of Rights. This Constitution doesn't have a Bill of Rights, we're not going to vote for it, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the Federalists agreed, look, if you'll vote yes, we'll add a Bill of Rights. And by then, they picked up enough votes that the yes votes ended up carrying the day in places like Virginia and New York, places like that. So the Anti-Federalists, they kind of lost the debate. You know, they were against the Constitution, they didn't want it ratified, and they lost the debate. However, in the end, they kind of won. And so to speak, we all kind of won because of them, because they got a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. And so much of now, when people think of the Constitution, I bet most people, overwhelming, probably 9 out of 10 people, when they think about the Constitution, they think about the Bill of Rights. All right, and so, you know, it's kind of weird to think that it's the Anti-Federalists, the people who were against the Constitution being ratified, are responsible for what most people probably consider perhaps the most important part of the Bill of Rights, this list of what rights we have as citizens. So after the first congressional election, James Madison is elected to the House of Representatives and almost immediately proposes 10 amendments, which become known as the Bill of Rights. When I say almost immediately, I do think it was almost immediately. I think he showed up, you know, when it's basically his first day in the legislature. I think he brought them with him from Virginia. He'd already had them written up, and he, you know, basically brought them in. So, oh, look what I've done since the election. And again, we have the Anti-Federalists to thank for that. Now, you don't have to write this down, but just know, Rhode Island finally ratified the Constitution in May of 1790. I mean, and to put this in perspective, George Washington and the first Congress took their offices in March of 1789. So the country had already been up and operating for over a year before Rhode Island finally ratifies the Constitution. And if you see on the right, they still only ratified it, 34 to 32. My guess is because the Constitution was so much about not treating all the states equally and taking more of the state power and giving it to the federal government, that Rhode Island, being the smallest state, kind of had the most to lose. Because, man, under the Articles of Confederation, when little bitty Rhode Island has just as much voting power as New York and Virginia, boy, the people in those states really kind of have a lot of power. But once power spread out more on a proportional basis and it goes to where the people live, Rhode Island had the most to lose. So I'm presuming that's why it took them the longest to say yes. But eventually they decided that being in the country was better than not being in the country, so they did vote for it. All right, so by this time, it's unanimous. All 13 states vote in favor of the Constitution, and the United States has a new Constitution and a new government. And going forward in this semester, we'll really focus on how that government's set up and how it operates.